They say a mother's love is unconditional, but nobody ever mentions what happens when that love becomes inconvenient. My name is Marcella, and at 55 years old, I learned that being the foundation of a family doesn't guarantee you'll have a place in it when the structure is complete. The plastic chair in the nursing home lobby felt cold against my back as I watched my son Diego sign the admission papers with the mechanical precision of someone filling out a grocery list. His wife Sandra stood beside him, checking her phone with the impatience of someone who had more important places to be, while my granddaughter Sophia refused to look in my direction, her eyes fixed on the institutional beige walls as if studying them for an exam she couldn't afford to fail. "It's just temporary, Mom," Diego said without meeting my eyes, the words falling from his lips like stones into still water, creating ripples of pain that would spread outward in ways he couldn't imagine. "Until we figure things out. You understand, right?" But I understood perfectly. I understood that the woman who had changed his diapers, walked the floors with him through countless feverish nights, worked double shifts to pay for his soccer cleats and school supplies, had become a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. I understood that my arthritic hands, which had kneaded dough for his birthday cakes and mended his torn jeans until they were more patch than original fabric, were now seen as liabilities rather than symbols of devotion. The nursing home director, a thin woman with kind eyes and practiced sympathy, explained the rules and visiting hours with the gentle efficiency of someone who'd delivered this speech hundreds of times to families who wore the same expression of guilty relief that painted my children's faces. "We have activities throughout the week," she said, gesturing toward a common room where elderly residents sat in wheelchairs arranged around a television broadcasting a game show nobody seemed to be watching. "Arts and crafts on Tuesdays, movie nights on Fridays, and we encourage family visits anytime during regular hours." Family visits. The phrase hung in the air like a promise nobody intended to keep. Sandra had already moved toward the exit, her designer purse clutched against her side like armor, while Sophia studied the floor tiles with the intensity of someone memorizing a map of her own escape route. Diego fumbled with my suitcase, the same battered piece of luggage I'd packed for our family vacations when he was small, when a week at the beach felt like the most magical adventure the world could offer. "Your room is on the second floor," the director continued, leading our peculiar parade down a hallway that smelled of industrial disinfectant, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Resignation, perhaps, or the accumulated weight of too many goodbyes spoken in whispers. "Room 237. You'll have a roommate initially, Mrs. Elena Vega. She's been here about 6 months and knows her way around quite well." The elevator ride lasted 30 seconds, but in that confined space with my family, the silence stretched like years. I wanted to ask Diego if he remembered the Christmas morning when he was 7, and I'd stayed up until 3 a.m. assembling his bicycle, my fingers bleeding from wrestling with instructions written in 3 languages, none of which seemed to correspond to the actual pieces scattered across our living room floor. I wanted to ask Sandra if she recalled the day she'd called me in tears, overwhelmed with a colicky baby and a husband who worked 16-hour days, and how I'd driven across town to rock Sophia to sleep, while Sandra finally got the rest she desperately needed. But I said nothing. Sometimes love means swallowing your words, even when they taste like broken glass going down. Room 237 was small but clean, with 2 single beds separated by a nightstand and a window that looked out onto the parking lot where Diego's car sat waiting like a getaway vehicle. Elena Vega was a tiny woman in her 70s, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize pain when it walked through her door. "First day?" she asked gently, and I nodded, unable to trust my voice not to crack like ice in spring thaw. "It gets easier. Not better necessarily, but easier." Diego placed my suitcase on the empty bed with the careful movements of someone handling evidence at a crime scene, then stood there looking around the room as if memorizing details for a report he'd never have to file. Sandra remained in the doorway, 1 foot already in the hallway, ready to flee the moment politeness allowed. "Well," Diego said, the word carrying the weight of everything we weren't saying to each other, everything that would remain buried beneath layers of justification and guilt. "We should probably let you get settled." Get settled. As if this institutional room with its industrial carpet and fluorescent lighting could ever become home. as if the single closet could contain not just my clothes, but the memories of the woman who had sewn most of them, staying up late at her ancient Singer sewing machine because store-bought dresses were luxuries we couldn't afford, as if the narrow bed could accommodate the weight of 55 years of experiences that had led to this moment of abandonment disguised as practicality. "I'll call you," Diego promised, and I almost believed him. The same way I'd believed him when he'd said he'd visit more often after his father died, when the house became too quiet and the days too long for a woman who'd spent 30 years organizing her life around other people's needs. The same way I'd believed Sandra when she'd promised to include me in family dinners before I became the inconvenient third wheel who reminded her that her husband had existed before she came along to perfect him. They hugged me goodbye, brief, obligatory embraces that felt like condolences at a funeral for someone still breathing. Sophia pecked my cheek with lips that barely made contact, her adolescent discomfort with my situation palpable in the way she pulled away quickly, as if age and abandonment might be contagious. And then they were gone, their footsteps echoing down the hallway like a countdown timer on everything I'd thought permanent in my life. Through the window, I watched Diego help Sandra into the passenger seat of his car, the same courteous gesture he'd learned by watching his father open doors for me during 32 years of marriage. But courtesy without love is just theater, and I was no longer part of their performance. If you enjoy these emotional stories that remind us of the strength we all carry inside, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to us. And please comment with your city, so I know where these stories are reaching people who understand that sometimes the hardest battles are fought in silence. Elena handed me a tissue I didn't realize I needed. "They always promise to call," she said softly, settling into the chair by the window. "Some do, some don't. But we survive either way." Survive. Such a harsh word for what I'd thought was living. But perhaps Elena was right. Perhaps survival was all any of us could hope for once we became inconvenient to the people we'd sacrificed everything to raise and nurture. Perhaps this sterile room wasn't the end of my story, but simply the beginning of a chapter I'd never planned to write. Outside, Diego's car disappeared around the corner, carrying my family back to their lives. Lives that had apparently grown too full to include the woman who'd made them possible in the first place. But I was still breathing. I was still thinking. And somewhere beneath the pain of abandonment, something else stirred. Something that felt suspiciously like determination. The first night in a place that wasn't home taught me that dignity doesn't require an audience, and strength sometimes grows strongest in the dark. The phone calls came less frequently than Diego had promised, and when they did come, they carried the hollow ring of obligation rather than affection. Every Tuesday at exactly 3 p.m., my son would call with the punctuality of someone checking items off a to-do list, his voice carrying the distant politeness he might use with a client whose account he was managing, rather than the woman who had sung him to sleep for the first 8 years of his life. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he'd ask, and I could hear the rustling of papers in the background, the click of computer keys that told me I was competing for attention with whatever work demanded his focus. "Are they treating you well there?" They, as if the nursing home staff were strangers imposed upon me rather than the people he'd chosen to replace himself in my daily care. As if asking about them absolved him of asking about the deeper questions that might require him to confront what he'd done to the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to keep him in Catholic school when public education felt too risky for her precious boy. "I'm fine," I'd always answer, because what else could I say? That I counted the hours between meals not because I was hungry, but because routine was the only structure left in a life that had been systematically dismantled. That I'd memorized the patterns on the institutional wallpaper because staring at walls had become my primary activity. That some nights I lay awake listening to Elena's gentle snoring and wondered if this was how my story was meant to end. Forgotten in a place where kindness came from strangers who were paid to provide it? "Good. That's good," Diego would respond with the relief of someone receiving positive news about a problem he'd successfully delegated to others. "Sandra sends her love." But Sandra never came to the phone herself. In 6 weeks of Tuesday calls, my daughter-in-law's love had been transmitted exclusively through Diego's increasingly strained assurances. as if her affection for me required a translator to make it comprehensible. I remembered the early years of their marriage, when Sandra would call me directly with questions about Diego's favorite meals, asking for my recipes with the enthusiasm of a bride eager to please her new husband. She'd seemed so grateful then for my guidance, so appreciative of the family traditions I'd carefully maintained and passed down like precious heirlooms. "Could you teach me how to make Diego's birthday cake?" she'd asked during their first year of marriage. Her voice bright with the kind of hope that comes from believing love can be expressed through perfectly measured ingredients and careful attention to detail. "He always talks about how special yours was when he was growing up." I'd spent an entire afternoon in her kitchen, patiently demonstrating the technique for folding flour into batter without deflating the eggs, explaining why my mother's secret ingredient, a tablespoon of coffee and chocolate cake, made all the difference. Sandra had taken notes in her careful handwriting, asking questions with the intensity of someone studying for an exam she couldn't afford to fail. But apparently my tutorials had served their purpose. Once Sandra had extracted what she needed from my knowledge, once she'd mastered the recipes and absorbed the family stories that would help her understand her husband's childhood, my usefulness had expired. The calls became less frequent, then stopped entirely. When I saw her at family gatherings, she was polite but distant, treating me with the courteous indifference she might show a neighbor whose name she couldn't quite remember. Sophia had been even more direct in her abandonment. My granddaughter, now 17 and armed with the casual cruelty that teenagers wield like weapons they don't fully understand, had made her position clear during what would be my last family dinner before the nursing home. "Abuela takes forever to tell stories," she'd complained when I'd tried to share a memory about her father's high school graduation. "Like, we get it. Dad was a good student. Can we move on?" The words had stung with the precision of a surgeon's blade, cutting through decades of carefully preserved family history that I'd hoped to pass down like treasured photographs, ensuring that future generations would understand where they came from and what sacrifices had built the foundation of their comfortable lives. "Sophia, show some respect," Diego had said, but his correction carried no real authority, the tone of someone going through the motions of parental guidance without any intention of enforcing actual consequences. Sandra had said nothing, her attention apparently absorbed by her phone, scrolling through whatever social media drama seemed more compelling than her aging mother-in-law's attempt to connect with family members who no longer found her relevant. "I'm just saying," Sophia had continued with the relentless logic of youth that hasn't yet learned when silence serves better than honesty. "It's kind of depressing how she repeats the same stories over and over. Like, Abuela, we know you loved Dad. We know you sacrificed everything, but that was like, your choice. You know? Your choice. As if love were a business decision that could be evaluated based on return on investment. As if the sleepless nights I'd spent nursing her father through pneumonia, the overtime shifts I'd worked to pay for his baseball equipment, the dreams I'd deferred so he could pursue his education, as if all of it had been calculated moves in some elaborate game rather than the natural expression of a mother's love for her child. "That's enough," Diego had finally said. But his intervention came too late, after the damage had been done, after my granddaughter had articulated what her father apparently felt but lacked the courage to say himself, that my love had become a burden, my memories an inconvenience, my very presence a reminder of obligations they no longer wished to honor. The weekly visit schedule Diego had optimistically outlined during my admission lasted exactly 3 weeks. Week 1, he came on Sunday afternoon with Sandra and Sophia, the 4 of us sitting in the common room making conversation so strained it felt like we were reading from scripts none of us had properly memorized. Week 2, only Diego appeared, explaining that Sandra had a headache and Sophia had homework that couldn't be postponed. Week 3 brought Diego alone again, this time with the excuse that Sandra's mother was visiting and needed their attention. By week 4, the visits stopped entirely, replaced by those Tuesday phone calls that felt less like family contact and more like welfare checks to ensure their legal obligations were being met. "We're just so busy right now," Diego explained during one of these calls, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone juggling too many responsibilities. "Sophia's applying to colleges. Sandra's mother has been having health issues. Work is absolutely crazy with this new project. But things should calm down soon, and then we'll be able to visit more regularly. Soon. The word that had replaced love in my family's vocabulary. Soon we'll visit. Soon things will be different. Soon we'll have more time. Soon became a destination that retreated further into the distance with each passing week. Like a mirage that dissolves the moment you get close enough to touch it. I began to understand that I'd been categorized, filed away in the section of Diego's life reserved for problems that had been solved through outsourcing. His mother's care had been transferred to professionals, freeing him to focus on the relationships and responsibilities he considered more pressing. I wasn't family anymore. I was a service being managed, an account being maintained through minimum required contact. Elena watched this systematic abandonment with the knowing sadness of someone who'd witnessed too many similar stories unfold in the hallways of our institutional home. "They tell themselves they're doing what's best for you," she said one evening as we sat by the window watching families come and go in the parking lot below. "Makes it easier for them to sleep at night." But I wasn't sleeping well at all. The narrow bed with its thin mattress and scratchy sheets felt like a prison compared to the queen-size bed I'd shared with my husband for 32 years. The bed where I'd nursed babies through midnight fevers and read bedtime stories that stretched for hours because Diego always wanted just one more chapter, just one more adventure before sleep claimed him. That bed was probably gone now, sold or donated along with everything else that had made my house a home. Diego had mentioned something about downsizing and simplifying when he'd cleaned out my belongings, keeping only what fit in the single dresser and small closet that represented my new life storage capacity. My wedding china, carefully preserved for special occasions that had become increasingly rare as my family grew busier and more distant, gone. The photo albums documenting every milestone of Diego's childhood, every birthday party and Christmas morning and soccer game where I'd cheered from the sidelines, condensed to a single shoebox that sat on my nightstand like a monument to a life that no longer seemed to matter to anyone but me. Even my cooking equipment, the tools that had allowed me to express love through carefully prepared meals for 30 years, had been deemed unnecessary for my new circumstances. The cast-iron skillet my mother had given me as a wedding gift, seasoned with decades of family dinners and Sunday brunches, the wooden spoons worn smooth by thousands of hours of stirring soups and sauces that had nourished the people I loved most, the recipe box filled with index cards stained by ingredients and marked with notes about Diego's preferences, more vanilla in the birthday cake, less salt in the soup because Sandra watched her blood pressure. All of it reduced to institutional meals served on plastic trays, food that nourished the body but left the soul hungry for the satisfaction that comes from feeding people you love with your own hands. I was becoming a ghost in my own family's story, present in their memories but absent from their daily lives, referred to in past tense even though I was still breathing, still thinking, still loving them with the same intensity that had defined every decision I'd made for the past 33 years. But ghosts, I was learning, sometimes see things that living people miss. And in my invisible state, I was beginning to notice details that my presence had previously obscured, truths that my family assumed I was too removed to discover. I tried harder after that. God forgive me, but I tried to make myself smaller, more convenient, less of the burden they clearly saw me as. When Diego's birthday approached in November, I asked Elena to help me call the local bakery to see if they could deliver a cake to his house. I wanted to surprise him with the same chocolate cake I'd made for 33 years, the one with my mother's secret coffee ingredient that had made every birthday feel special. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the bakery clerk said when I explained what I wanted. "We don't deliver to individual homes. You'd need to arrange pickup or have someone collect it for you." Of course. Everything required someone else now, some intermediary to bridge the gap between my desires and reality. I couldn't simply bake a cake in my own kitchen, couldn't wrap it carefully and drive it to my son's house, couldn't see his face light up the way it had when he was 7 years old, and believed his mother was capable of magic. Instead, I had to call Diego and ask him to pick up his own birthday cake, turning what should have been a gesture of love into another inconvenience for his already busy schedule. "Mom, you really didn't need to do that," he said, and I could hear the forced gratitude in his voice, the tone people use when they're trying to appreciate a gift they neither wanted nor needed. We usually just grab something from the grocery store these days. Sandra's been on this health kick, trying to cut back on sugar and all that. Sandra's health kick. As if 33 years of birthday tradition could be dismissed because my daughter-in-law had discovered the benefits of reduced sugar intake. As if the love baked into every layer of that cake could be replaced by something more nutritionally optimal from the grocery store's refrigerated case. I understand, I said, though I didn't understand at all. I didn't understand how a family could abandon traditions that had once meant everything, how efficiency could matter more than sentiment, how my son could sound so relieved to be released from the obligation of acknowledging that his mother still remembered the day he was born. The cake sat in the nursing home's refrigerator for 3 days, before Elena and I finally shared it with the other residents during our weekly social hour. Mrs. Patterson, who rarely spoke anymore due to her advancing dementia, smiled when she tasted it and said it reminded her of cakes her mother used to make. At least someone appreciated the coffee secret, even if she wouldn't remember it the next day. Thanksgiving arrived like a test I was destined to fail. The nursing home served turkey and all the traditional sides in their dining room, decorated with paper pilgrim cutouts that looked like elementary school art projects. The staff tried their best to make it festive, but institutional holiday celebrations have a hollow quality that no amount of orange crepe paper can disguise. I'd assumed, foolishly as it turned out, that Diego would invite me to join their family celebration. For 33 years, I'd hosted Thanksgiving dinner, spending days preparing dishes that Diego and Sandra praised with the enthusiasm of people experiencing genuinely good food. My stuffing recipe had been requested by Sandra's mother, who'd claimed it was better than her own family's traditional version. My pumpkin pie had been Sophia's favorite dessert, the one she'd ask for year-round whenever she wanted something special. But the invitation never came. Instead, Diego called on Thursday morning to wish me a happy Thanksgiving, his voice bright with the artificial cheer people use when they're trying to compensate for their own guilt. "We're having dinner at Sandra's mother's house this year," he explained, as if this were a natural evolution rather than a deliberate exclusion. "Her place is bigger, and she's been wanting to host for years. You understand how family dynamics work." Family dynamics. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was slowly consuming everything I'd spent decades building. Apparently, I no longer qualified as family dynamics. I'd been reclassified as something else, an obligation that could be managed through phone calls rather than place settings. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? That I'd been looking forward to seeing Sophia help with the gravy the way I'd taught her last year. That I'd hoped to continue the tradition of everyone sharing what they were grateful for. A ritual that had helped us feel connected even during difficult years. That I'd wanted to sit at the table I'd set for so many holidays, surrounded by the people who were supposed to love me more than anyone else in the world. "We'll miss you," Diego added, and the lie tasted bitter even through the phone line. If they were going to miss me, they would have found a way to include me. If my presence mattered, someone would have suggested that Sandra's mother's bigger house could certainly accommodate one more person, especially the grandmother of the family's only child. But missing someone and wanting them present are two different things, and I was learning to distinguish between guilt-driven sentiment and genuine desire for my company. Christmas preparations began in the nursing home with the same determined cheerfulness that had characterized Thanksgiving. Garland appeared in the hallways. A tree was erected in the common room, and the activities director announced plans for a holiday concert featuring local school children who would sing carols for the residents. I found myself looking forward to Diego's visit with the desperate hope of someone clinging to the last piece of debris from a shipwreck. Surely Christmas would be different. Surely the holiday that had always been our family's most treasured celebration would remind my son of what we'd meant to each other, of the magic we'd created together during Sophia's childhood, when she'd believed in Santa Claus and the power of wishes made on Christmas morning. I spent weeks planning what I would give them, calculating how to stretch my small nursing home allowance to purchase meaningful gifts. Elena helped me order presents online using her tablet. A cookbook for Sandra, featuring healthy versions of traditional recipes, a leather-bound journal for Sophia to record her thoughts during her senior year of high school, and for Diego, a framed photograph of the two of us from his college graduation. The day when he'd hugged me so tightly and whispered that none of his success would have been possible without my sacrifices. The gifts arrived 10 days before Christmas, wrapped carefully in paper I'd chosen to match each recipient's personality. I arranged them under the small tree in our room, imagining the moment when my family would open them and remember that love doesn't require expensive price tags. That thoughtfulness matters more than monetary value. December 23rd came and went without a visit. December 24th arrived with its promise of Christmas Eve magic. But my family was apparently creating that magic somewhere else, with people who weren't confined to institutions and didn't require special arrangements to include in holiday celebrations. On Christmas morning, I called Diego myself, breaking the Tuesday routine that had become our only regular contact. "Mom! Merry Christmas!" he answered, and I could hear voices in the background. Sandra's laughter, Sophia's excited chatter, the sounds of a family celebration in full swing. "I'm so glad you called. We were just talking about you. Talking about me." The phrase that had replaced talking to me in my family's vocabulary. I'd become a topic of conversation rather than a participant in it, someone to be discussed rather than included. "I have gifts for you," I said, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "I was hoping you might stop by today, or maybe I could arrange for them to be delivered." The pause that followed stretched long enough for me to hear my heart beating in the silence, long enough for me to understand that my Christmas gifts represented another inconvenience in a day already planned around other people's needs. "That's so sweet of you, Mom," Diego finally said, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone trying to sound grateful, while calculating the logistics of an unwanted obligation. "Today's going to be pretty crazy here, with Sandra's parents and her sister's family coming over. Maybe we can figure something out next week." Next week, after Christmas had passed, after the magic had faded, after my gifts would feel like afterthoughts rather than expressions of love, after it no longer mattered whether I'd remembered them, because they'd already celebrated without me. "Of course," I said, though my throat felt like it was closing around the words. "Next week is fine." But next week came and went, and the week after that, and my carefully chosen gifts remained under Elena's tree until she gently suggested we donate them to the nursing home's charity drive for families in need. "At least someone will appreciate them," she said softly, and I nodded because I couldn't trust myself to speak without crying. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. I'd raised a son who saw my love as a debt that had been fully paid rather than a bond that required ongoing nurturing. I'd invested everything in a family that had used my sacrifices as stepping stones to a life that no longer had room for the woman who'd made it possible. But the hardest part wasn't their absence from my holidays. It was the gradual realization that they were relieved by my removal from their lives, that placing me in the nursing home had solved a problem they'd been too polite to articulate while I still lived independently. I was no longer the matriarch of the family I'd built. I was the remnant of someone else's past, a reminder of obligations they'd rather forget, a woman whose usefulness had expired the moment her care became more complex than they were willing to provide. The other residents began to feel like my real family, bound together by our shared experience of being loved conditionally, by people who'd found it easier to delegate our care than to rearrange their lives to accommodate our needs. We understood each other in ways our actual families never would, connected by the particular pain of being forgotten by people who were supposed to love us most. The phone calls stopped coming in February, not gradually, not with excuses or apologies, but with the abrupt finality of a door slamming shut. The Tuesday routine that had been my only remaining connection to the family I'd built simply ceased to exist, as if someone had decided that even 5 minutes of weekly obligation was too much to spare for the woman who'd given them everything. I waited by the phone that first Tuesday, watching the minutes tick past 3 o'clock, then 3:15, then 3:30. Elena pretended not to notice my vigil, busying herself with a crossword puzzle while I sat frozen in the chair beside my nightstand, my hand resting on the receiver as if willing it to ring through sheer determination. But silence has its own weight, and by 4 o'clock that silence had settled into my chest like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to dislodge. I understood then that I'd been severed completely, cut away from my son's life with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing something diseased that threatened the health of everything around it. The nursing home staff, trained to recognize the signs of family abandonment, began treating me with the particular gentleness reserved for residents whose relatives had stopped pretending to care. They spoke more softly, lingered longer during routine checks, offered extra portions at meals as if food could somehow compensate for the human connection that had been withdrawn without warning or explanation. "Maybe he's traveling for work," suggested Carmen, the nurse who administered my blood pressure medication each morning. Business trips can be unpredictable. But we both knew that business trips didn't last indefinitely, that even the busiest professional could find 30 seconds to call his mother and explain why their weekly routine had been disrupted. Carmen was offering hope the way medical professionals offer pain medication, not because it would cure anything, but because it might make the suffering more bearable. I spent the following week studying every interaction I'd had with Diego, dissecting our conversations for clues about what I might have done wrong, what invisible line I'd crossed that had triggered this final abandonment. Had I complained too much about the nursing home food? Had I sounded too needy when I'd asked about Christmas visits? Had my gifts embarrassed him somehow, made him feel guilty about the disparity between my circumstances and his comfortable life? But no matter how thoroughly I examined my behavior, I couldn't identify a specific transgression that warranted this complete erasure from his existence. The only explanation that made sense was the one I'd been avoiding. My value to Diego had expired the moment my care became his responsibility, and now that professionals had assumed that burden, there was simply no reason for him to maintain even minimal contact. Elena found me crying one evening while watching families visit other residents, my tears flowing with the steady persistence of rain from clouds that seemed permanently positioned overhead. She sat beside me on the small couch in the common room, her weathered hand finding mine with the gentle authority of someone who'd comforted too many women facing identical circumstances. "They tell themselves stories," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the television program that provided background noise for our daily disappointments. "Stories about how we're better off here, how we're getting professional care they couldn't provide, how they're visiting in spirit even when they're not visiting in person. The stories get easier to believe the longer they go without seeing us." I wanted to argue with her assessment, to defend Diego against accusations that felt too harsh even though they matched perfectly with his behavior. But mothers protect their children even when those children have stopped protecting them, even when the evidence suggests that protection is no longer deserved or appreciated. "He used to call me every day when his father was dying," I whispered, remembering those terrible weeks when cancer consumed my husband with systematic cruelty. Sometimes twice a day. He was so worried about me, so concerned about how I was handling everything. Elena nodded with the understanding of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize the patterns that governed human relationships. "Grief makes people feel helpless," she said. "Calling you made him feel useful. But now that you're settled somewhere safe, he doesn't need to feel useful anymore. You've been transformed from a person with needs into a problem that's been solved." The accuracy of her observation cut deeper than any deliberate cruelty could have managed. Diego hadn't stopped loving me. He'd simply recategorized me from active family member to managed obligation, like a mortgage payment or insurance premium that required occasional attention but didn't demand emotional investment. March arrived with its promise of spring renewal, but inside the nursing home, seasons felt theoretical rather than real. The changing weather existed beyond windows that didn't open, glimpsed during brief walks in the courtyard that served as our only connection to the natural world. I watched other residents receive visitors bearing flowers and Easter chocolates, observed their faces brighten with the kind of joy that comes from being remembered by people who choose to remember you rather than professionals who are paid to provide care. Mrs. Patterson, whose dementia had progressed to the point where she rarely recognized anyone, lit up like a child when her granddaughter arrived with pictures from a school play. "Look, Grandma," the teenager said, her voice patient and kind despite the fact that Mrs. Patterson had forgotten her name 3 times during the conversation. "I played the lead role, just like you did in high school." The fact that Mrs. Patterson couldn't retain this information didn't diminish her granddaughter's dedication to sharing it. Love didn't require memory to justify its expression. didn't demand intellectual engagement to validate its worth. This 17-year-old girl understood something my adult son had apparently forgotten, that showing up matters more than being understood, that presence is a gift that doesn't require reciprocal comprehension to be meaningful. I began writing letters I never intended to send, filling composition notebooks with words I wished I could speak to the people who'd stopped listening. Long letters to Diego explaining how proud I remained of his accomplishments, how grateful I felt for the years when we'd been close, how much I missed the version of him who'd called me his best friend and meant it. Letters to Sandra acknowledging that I understood her need to prioritize her own family, while wishing she could find room in that family for one more person who'd loved Diego longer than anyone else alive. Letters to Sophia describing the dreams I'd had for her future, the wisdom I'd hoped to share during her transition to adulthood, the stories about her father's childhood that would help her understand where she came from. The letters accumulated in my nightstand drawer like prayers that had been written instead of spoken, evidence of love that had nowhere to go except onto paper where it couldn't embarrass anyone or require responses that might prove inconvenient. Elena never asked about my writing, but I sometimes caught her watching me with the expression of someone who recognized the therapeutic value of words that would never be read by their intended recipients. Spring turned to summer, and my family's absence stretched from months into something that felt permanent, irreversible, final. Other residents received visitors regularly, children who'd driven hours to spend afternoons playing cards, grandchildren who'd sacrificed weekend plans to share stories about school and friends, and the ordinary details of lives being lived with enthusiasm and purpose. But my visitor log remained empty. My name never called during afternoon social hours, my mailbox perpetually vacant except for medical bills and administrative notices from the nursing home's business office. I'd become a woman without a family, a mother without children who acknowledged her existence, a grandmother whose lineage had been severed by people who'd decided that genetic connection didn't require ongoing relationship. The deepest pain wasn't their absence. It was the growing certainty that they were happier without me, that Diego's life had become simpler, less complicated, more manageable once he'd delegated my care to strangers, that Sandra no longer had to navigate the delicate politics of including her husband's mother in family celebrations, that Sophia could focus on her senior year without the burden of visiting a grandmother who represented aging and mortality, and the inconvenient reality that youth doesn't last forever. I'd been erased from their daily experience so completely that I wondered if they ever thought about me at all, or if my nursing home placement had been so successful that I'd simply faded from their consciousness like a problem that had been solved so thoroughly it no longer required consideration. But in the darkest moments of that realization, when despair felt like drowning in plain sight while surrounded by people who couldn't save me, something unexpected began stirring in the depths of my abandoned heart. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile for what I was experiencing. Something more substantial, more dangerous, more permanent. I remembered the conversation I'd had with my lawyer 3 years earlier, the documents I'd signed in the presence of witnesses, the decisions I'd made about my estate that no one in my family had bothered to discuss with me since my husband's death. They'd assumed my financial affairs were simple, straightforward, easily managed by people who'd never asked about the details. But I'd been making careful decisions for longer than they realized, protecting myself in ways they'd never thought to investigate. I still had something they didn't know about, something that hadn't been shared because it hadn't seemed important while I was healthy and independent and able to manage my own affairs, something that might change everything if I decided to use it. And in the suffocating quiet of my abandoned life, surrounded by the evidence of my family's relief at my absence, I was beginning to think that perhaps it was time they learned exactly who they'd chosen to discard. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began in small moments that others might have mistaken for resignation, but I recognized as something entirely different. The quiet gathering of strength that comes when you finally stop wasting energy on people who've proven themselves unworthy of your devotion. I stopped waiting for phone calls, not with dramatic gestures or tearful declarations, but with the simple understanding that my Tuesday afternoons belonged to me now, not to the disappointment of silence that had been consuming them for months. I began using that time to walk the hallways, learning the stories of other residents whose families had also discovered that love came with expiration dates they hadn't bothered to mention during the years when care flowed only in one direction. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, whose 3 successful children lived within 20 miles, but visited once a month with the dutiful efficiency of people checking items off a to-do list. Her son had become a prominent surgeon, her eldest daughter managed a law firm, and her youngest had built a thriving restaurant business. All achievements that Mrs. Rodriguez had supported through decades of babysitting grandchildren, providing emergency loans, and offering unconditional emotional support during their struggles to establish careers. "They're busy," she would say when other residents asked about her infrequent visitors. The same explanation I'd used to justify Diego's absence. Important people have important responsibilities, but I began to understand that being busy was a choice, that importance was often a matter of priorities rather than circumstances. Mrs. Rodriguez's children had time for golf tournaments and wine tastings and weekend getaways, but somehow couldn't find time for more than their monthly obligation visits to the woman who'd made their success possible. Elena, who'd been observing my gradual shift from despair to something harder and more determined, began sharing her own story during our evening conversations. Her daughter lived in California, 3,000 miles away from the nursing home in Ohio, where Elena had been placed after a stroke that had left her temporarily unable to manage her medications independently. Temporarily, Elena repeated with bitter emphasis. That was 4 years ago. My physical therapy ended after 6 months. My medication routine stabilized after 1 year, and my doctor cleared me for independent living 2 years ago. But somehow California keeps getting farther away, and my daughter keeps getting busier with her new husband and his teenage children who require so much attention. Elena's independence had been restored, but her family had apparently grown comfortable with the arrangement that kept her safely contained in professional care while they pursued their lives without the complication of an aging parent who might need occasional assistance or regular companionship. I started paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked, studying the patterns that governed family visits like an anthropologist, documenting the customs of a culture I was trying to understand. The residents with the most frequent visitors were invariably those whose families needed something: access to Social Security checks, signatures on legal documents, information about insurance policies or bank accounts. Mrs. Williams received weekly visits from her grandson, but only because she was co-signing student loans for his college education. The visits would end abruptly after each document was signed, despite her obvious longing for extended conversation. Mr. Chen's son appeared monthly to handle his father's finances, efficiently reviewing bank statements and paying bills before departing with the satisfied expression of someone who'd fulfilled his obligations. But residents like Mrs. Patterson, whose dementia made her legally incompetent to manage any financial affairs, rarely saw family members except during major holidays when guilt became too heavy to ignore. The correlation between usefulness and attention was impossible to miss once you started looking for it. I began requesting meetings with the nursing home's social worker, a kind woman named Janet, who specialized in helping residents navigate family relationships that had been complicated by the realities of aging and institutional care. During our sessions, I asked careful questions about legal rights, about the documentation required for various decisions, about the procedures that governed financial arrangements when elderly people needed assistance managing their affairs. "Are you having concerns about your son's handling of your finances?" Janet asked during one of these conversations, her professional training alerting her to the possibility that Diego might be exploiting his access to my resources. "Not at all," I replied truthfully. "Diego has never been involved in my financial affairs. I've always managed everything independently, and that hasn't changed since I've been here." Janet's surprise was evident in her expression. Most nursing home residents required family assistance with banking, bill paying, and investment management, especially those dealing with the costs of long-term care that could quickly exhaust personal savings. But I'd maintained complete control over my resources, had never transferred any authority to Diego, despite his obvious assumption that placement in professional care meant he'd eventually need to assume financial guardianship. "That's unusual," Janet admitted. Most families have had those conversations by the time placement becomes necessary. Have you considered discussing your financial arrangements with your son, just to ensure everyone understands your wishes and capabilities? But I was discovering that keeping Diego uninformed about my financial affairs had been one of the wisest decisions I'd made in recent years. His assumptions about my helplessness extended beyond physical care to every aspect of my independence, and I was beginning to understand that those assumptions might become very useful if circumstances required me to surprise him. I started requesting copies of my medical records, ostensibly to better understand my health status, but actually to confirm that my cognitive abilities were thoroughly documented as normal, that no physician had ever suggested I was incompetent to make my own decisions. The records painted a clear picture of a physically healthy woman whose placement in the nursing home had been social rather than medical, a choice based on family convenience rather than medical necessity. Elena watched my increased activity with the knowing smile of someone who recognized purposeful behavior when she saw it. "You're planning something," she observed one evening as I organized the paperwork I'd been collecting in a folder that lived in my nightstand drawer. "I'm educating myself," I replied, which was true enough, learning about things I never needed to know before. But education can be preparation, and preparation can be the foundation for action, and action can transform situations that seem hopeless into outcomes that serve justice rather than convenience. I began walking more, using the nursing home's physical therapy equipment not because I needed rehabilitation, but because I wanted to ensure my strength remained adequate for whatever decisions lay ahead. I participated in the activities program with new enthusiasm, demonstrating cognitive abilities that had never been impaired but needed to be visible to staff members who might eventually be called upon to testify about my mental competence. Most importantly, I started paying careful attention to conversations around me, listening to other residents discuss their family relationships with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence about enemy territories. I learned which lawyers specialized in elder law, which social workers had experience with family financial abuse, which medical professionals understood the difference between physical placement for convenience and actual need for institutional care. The nursing home library became my second home, where I researched legal precedents involving elderly parents who'd been abandoned by adult children, cases where financial control had been assumed without proper authorization, situations where assumptions about mental competence had been challenged by elderly people who'd been underestimated by families who'd stopped seeing them as individuals capable of independent thought and action. I wasn't plotting revenge. Revenge was too crude, too obvious, too dependent on emotional satisfaction rather than practical results. I was preparing for justice, the kind of systematic correction that restores proper balance to relationships that have become distorted by selfishness and assumptions of powerlessness. Diego had made the mistake of believing that physical placement equaled total control, that my residence in the nursing home meant he could safely ignore me indefinitely without consequences. Sandra had assumed that removing me from family celebrations eliminated any need to consider my feelings or include me in decisions that affected my life. Sophia had concluded that my age and circumstances made my opinions irrelevant to her future choices. But they'd all forgotten something crucial. I'd been making careful decisions about my life and resources for 55 years before Diego was born. I'd navigated challenges and solved problems and protected my interests through decades of experience they'd never bothered to ask about or acknowledge. I'd been underestimated before, by employers who thought women couldn't handle financial responsibilities, by neighbors who assumed single mothers couldn't raise successful children, by circumstances that seemed designed to defeat people who lacked the determination to prove them wrong. The difference now was that I no longer cared about maintaining relationships with people who demonstrated that they didn't value my presence in their lives. I no longer needed their approval or feared their disappointment. I was free to act in my own interests without considering how my choices might affect people who'd already decided my feelings didn't matter. And that freedom, I was discovering, was the most dangerous weapon an underestimated woman could possess. Elena found me smiling one evening as I organized my documentation, and she asked what had brought about my obvious change in mood. "I just remembered something important," I told her, and it was the absolute truth. I remembered exactly who I am. September brought the kind of crisp autumn air that had always reminded me of new beginnings, fresh starts, second chances. As I walked through the nursing home's small garden, watching leaves turn colors that would soon carpet the ground, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Not the desperate hope that had sustained me through those early weeks of abandonment, but the steady confidence of someone who had finally decided to stop being a victim of other people's choices. My lawyer arrived on a Thursday afternoon, precisely at 2 o'clock as we'd arranged during our phone conversation the previous week. Margaret Chen, no relation to Mr. Chen, our financially useful resident, was a woman in her 60s who specialized in elder law and had built her practice on the understanding that age often brought clarity rather than confusion, wisdom rather than incompetence. "Mrs. Marcela Santos," she said, shaking my hand with the firm grip of someone who recognized strength when she encountered it, regardless of the setting. "I'm pleased to finally meet you in person. Your call intrigued me quite a bit." I'd chosen Margaret carefully after researching dozens of attorneys through the nursing home's computer access program. Her reputation for representing elderly clients who'd been underestimated by their families was exactly what I needed, and her successful track record in cases involving financial autonomy and family manipulation had convinced me she was the right advocate for what I had in mind. We met in the nursing home's small conference room, a space typically used for family meetings about care plans and discharge discussions. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using this room to plan something my family had no idea was coming, something that would fundamentally alter the assumptions they'd built their comfortable distance upon. "Let me begin by saying I'm impressed with your preparation," Margaret said, reviewing the documents I'd assembled over the past months. "Your medical records clearly establish cognitive competence, your financial records demonstrate complete independence, and your legal documentation is more thorough than most people maintain, even when they're living in their own homes." She was referring to the folder I'd been building, thick with evidence of my mental clarity, physical capability, and financial autonomy. Every conversation with Janet, every request for medical records, every interaction with nursing home staff had been carefully documented, creating an irrefutable record that I was neither incompetent nor helpless, regardless of my current living situation. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish?" Margaret asked, settling back in her chair with the expression of someone preparing to hear a story she suspected would be both interesting and legally complex. I told her everything: about Diego's systematic withdrawal from my life, about the promises that had evaporated like morning mist, about the Christmas gifts that had never been acknowledged, and the phone calls that had simply stopped coming. I explained how I'd been transformed from beloved family matriarch to inconvenient obligation to forgotten burden in the span of less than a year. But more importantly, I told her about the financial arrangements Diego knew nothing about, the legal decisions I'd made quietly over the years while he assumed my modest lifestyle reflected modest resources. I described the property investments I'd made using life insurance money after my husband's death, the careful stock portfolio I'd built through decades of small but consistent purchases, the savings accounts Diego had never known existed because he'd never asked about my financial affairs. Margaret's eyebrows rose progressively higher as I outlined the true scope of my resources, the legal structures I'd put in place to protect my assets, and most importantly, the will I'd had updated just 6 months before my nursing home placement. A document Diego assumed would be simple because he believed there was little to inherit. "You're telling me that your son placed you in long-term care while believing you had minimal assets, and that you've never corrected this misunderstanding?" Margaret asked, her professional composure barely concealing what might have been admiration. "He never asked," I replied simply, "and I never volunteered information that wasn't requested." The truth was that Diego's assumptions about my financial situation had been convenient for both of us, in different ways. He'd been able to place me in the nursing home without feeling guilty about the costs, because he believed my resources were limited, and that institutional care was the most economical option for someone in my circumstances. I'd been able to maintain complete control over my assets while he remained blissfully unaware that his mother possessed the means to make choices he'd never considered. "Have you considered the possibility that your son might be more attentive if he understood your actual financial situation?" Margaret asked, probing the motivations behind my secrecy. But I'd moved beyond wanting Diego's attention. The months of silence had clarified something important. I didn't want a relationship that depended on my usefulness, whether financial or otherwise. If my son could only value me when I represented an asset rather than a responsibility, then his feelings weren't worth cultivating or preserving. I'm not interested in purchasing affection, I told Margaret. I'm interested in ensuring that people who've proven themselves unworthy of my consideration are no longer in a position to benefit from my resources or make assumptions about my capabilities. Margaret nodded with the understanding of someone who'd handled similar cases, elderly clients who'd been systematically ignored or dismissed by families who viewed them as burdens, rather than people deserving of respect and consideration. "What specifically do you want to accomplish?" she asked, opening her legal pad to begin taking notes. I outlined my goals with the precision of someone who'd spent months thinking through every detail. I wanted to establish legal documentation that proved my competence and independence, ensuring that no one could claim I'd been manipulated or coerced into making decisions contrary to my best interests. I wanted to create a trust structure that would protect my assets from any future attempts by Diego to claim authority over my affairs. And most importantly, I wanted to revise my will in ways that would teach certain people the cost of taking love for granted. "This is perfectly legal," Margaret assured me. "And frankly, it's the kind of planning more elderly people should undertake to protect themselves from family members who view them as sources of eventual inheritance rather than individuals deserving of respect." We spent 2 hours reviewing my current legal arrangements and discussing modifications that would accomplish my objectives while ensuring everything remained legally sound and ethically appropriate. Margaret explained the documentation we'd need to create, the witnesses required for various signatures, and the timeline for implementing changes that would transform my family's assumptions into very expensive mistakes. "I should mention," Margaret said as we concluded our meeting, "that your current will, if it remains unchanged, would leave everything to your son. Are you prepared for the emotional complexity of altering that arrangement?" But the emotional complexity had already been resolved during those long months of Tuesday afternoons spent waiting for phone calls that never came, during holidays celebrated in institutional dining rooms, while my family enjoyed gatherings I was no longer invited to attend. Diego had already demonstrated how much my love meant to him, had already shown me the exact value he placed on 33 years of maternal devotion. My son made his choices, I told Margaret. Now I'm making mine. The legal work would take several weeks to complete, during which time I would continue living exactly as I had been, participating in nursing home activities, chatting with other residents, maintaining the appearance of someone who'd accepted her circumstances with resignation. Diego would continue his silence, Sandra would continue her indifference, and Sophia would continue her adolescent assumption that elderly people existed primarily as inconveniences to be managed rather than individuals with thoughts and feelings and agency. But beneath the surface of routine, everything was changing. Documents were being prepared that would ensure my independence could never again be assumed away by people who viewed my age as evidence of incompetence. Financial arrangements were being restructured to protect resources from family members who demonstrated they couldn't be trusted with emotional responsibilities, much less financial ones. Elena watched this process with the satisfaction of someone observing justice being methodically prepared rather than emotionally demanded. "They have no idea what's coming," she said one evening as I organized the latest paperwork Margaret had sent for my review. "That's the point," I replied. "Surprises are most effective when they're completely unexpected." I'd learned something valuable during my months of abandonment, that being underestimated was actually a form of power, that people who dismissed you as harmless were more likely to ignore the preparations you made right in front of them. Diego's failure to call hadn't just hurt my feelings. It had given me months of uninterrupted time to make decisions without interference or questioning from people who might have opinions about choices that were mine alone to make. The woman my family had discarded was gone, replaced by someone harder, clearer, more focused on protecting herself than pleasing others. They'd created this version of me through their neglect, their assumptions, their casual dismissal of love that had once been unconditional, but had learned to set boundaries. And soon they would meet her properly, in circumstances they'd never anticipated. holding papers they'd never expected to see, making decisions they'd never imagined she was capable of making. The only question remaining was whether they'd recognize their own handiwork when they encountered the woman their abandonment had created. The call came on a Tuesday in November, exactly 8 months after Diego had stopped his weekly check-ins. But this time, I wasn't sitting by the phone waiting for connection that might never come. This time, I was in the common room helping Mrs. Patterson work a jigsaw puzzle when Carmen approached with the cordless phone and an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Santos, you have a call," she said, extending the phone with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to make assumptions about family communications. "It's your son." For just a moment, I felt an echo of the old Marcella, the woman who would have dropped everything to rush toward any contact with her child, grateful for whatever scraps of attention he was willing to offer. But that woman had been systematically destroyed over months of silence, replaced by someone who understood that desperate gratitude was just another form of powerlessness. "Thank you, Carmen," I said, accepting the phone without hurrying, without the eager desperation that had once characterized my approach to Diego's increasingly rare communications. "Hello, Diego." "Mom." His voice carried a strain I hadn't heard before, tight with something that might have been panic, barely held in check. "I need to talk to you. Are you okay? I mean, mentally? Cognitively? The staff there hasn't noticed any confusion or problems with your thinking?" The question revealed so much about his assumptions. His comfortable belief that my silence over the past months meant I'd deteriorated rather than evolved, that my lack of demands for his attention indicated diminished capacity rather than diminished interest in maintaining a relationship that brought me nothing but pain. "I'm perfectly fine, Diego," I said, settling back into my chair while Mrs. Patterson continued working on her puzzle, her concentration undisturbed by my conversation. "My mind is as clear as it's ever been. Why do you ask?" "There's been some kind of mistake," he said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background, the frantic shuffling of documents that weren't making the sense he expected them to make. "I got a call from some lawyer, Margaret something, saying she represents you. She's talking about legal changes, about financial arrangements I don't understand." "Mom, did someone trick you into signing something? Are people taking advantage of you?" The irony was so perfect it almost made me smile. After 8 months of treating me like I was too incompetent to deserve regular phone calls, Diego was now concerned that I might be too competent to manipulate, that my mental clarity might pose problems for assumptions he'd never bothered to verify. "No one has taken advantage of me," I replied with the calm certainty of someone who'd spent months preparing for exactly this conversation. "I've simply been making some legal arrangements that protect my interests and clarify my wishes. Surely you don't object to me managing my own affairs." "Your affairs?" The pitch of his voice rose with something approaching desperation. "Mom? What affairs? I mean, the nursing home costs, your limited income from Social Security. I assumed you needed help managing what little you had. What financial arrangements could you possibly need to make?" And there it was, the assumption that had governed every decision he'd made about my life for the past year. Diego had placed me in the nursing home believing I was both financially and cognitively diminished, too poor to afford alternatives and too confused to advocate for myself. His relief at my institutional placement hadn't just been about delegating my care. It had been about managing what he'd assumed was my inevitable decline into poverty and dependence. "You assumed incorrectly," I said, my voice carrying the weight of months of accumulated clarity. "Perhaps if you'd maintained regular contact, if you'd asked questions about my circumstances rather than making decisions based on your own convenience, you might have a better understanding of my actual situation." The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat, long enough for Diego to begin processing the implications of what I'd just told him. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, carrying the careful politeness of someone who'd realized he might have seriously miscalculated a situation he'd thought he understood completely. "Mom, maybe we should meet. Maybe I should drive over this afternoon so we can discuss whatever's happening. I think there might be some confusion about what you're trying to accomplish." But I was no longer interested in meetings designed to manage my choices or conversations intended to redirect my decisions toward outcomes that served his comfort rather than my interests. The time for his input had expired, along with his weekly phone calls, had evaporated during the holidays he'd been too busy to include me in, had been forfeited through months of benign neglect that had taught me exactly how much my feelings mattered to the family I'd sacrificed everything to build. "There's no confusion, Diego," I said, watching Mrs. Patterson successfully place a piece of sky into her puzzle, her face lighting up with the satisfaction of small victories. "There are simply consequences. Actions have consequences, choices have consequences, and neglect has consequences. You're about to learn about all of them. What are you talking about?" Now his voice carried unmistakable fear, the tone of someone who'd realized that a situation he'd thought was under control had somehow shifted beyond his ability to manage or influence. "Mom, whatever you think I've done, whatever you're upset about, we can work it out. We can talk about this. We can talk." The phrase that had replaced actual talking in our relationship, the promise that had been offered and withdrawn so many times it had lost all meaning. But talking required two people who respected each other enough to listen, and Diego had proven over months of silence that my thoughts and feelings weren't worth his attention, unless they posed problems for his comfortable assumption that I could be safely ignored indefinitely. "Actually, Diego, we can't work this out," I said, surprised by how calm I felt, how steady my voice remained despite the magnitude of what I was about to explain. "You see, working things out requires ongoing relationship, mutual respect, regular communication. It requires treating people like they matter, even when they're not immediately useful to you. You chose a different approach." I could hear him breathing, could almost picture him in his office or his kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable life I'd helped make possible, finally understanding that his carefully maintained distance from my circumstances might have hidden important information he should have been paying attention to all along. "The lawyer you spoke with represents my interests in revising my estate planning," I continued, each word carefully chosen for maximum clarity. "As you'll discover, your assumptions about my financial situation were as inaccurate as your assumptions about my need for your attention. I've been financially independent throughout this entire experience, Diego. I chose to remain in the nursing home because it provided me with the peace and clarity I needed to make some important decisions about my future." "Your future?" he echoed. And I could hear the dawning comprehension that his mother's future might not automatically include the financial provisions he'd been counting on, the inheritance he'd never asked about but had apparently been assuming would eventually compensate him for whatever minimal effort he'd been willing to invest in our relationship. My future, Diego. The years I have left to live according to my own values and priorities, surrounded by people who actually value my presence, rather than simply tolerate it out of obligation. The nursing home has been very educational. I've learned to distinguish between people who care about me and people who care about what I might eventually leave them. The silence stretched again, but this time I could hear the sound of his world shifting, his comfortable assumptions about his mother's helplessness and dependence crumbling under the weight of information he'd never bothered to gather. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, more careful, the tone of someone who'd realized he was no longer controlling a conversation he'd expected to manage. "Mom, I don't understand what you're saying. Are you telling me you don't need to be in the nursing home? Are you saying you could afford other arrangements?" "I'm saying I could afford many different arrangements, Diego. I'm saying that for 8 months, you've been comfortable ignoring a woman you believed was financially helpless and cognitively declining. I'm saying that your relief at my institutional placement was based on assumptions you never verified because you never cared enough to ask the right questions." I could hear him moving now, probably pacing in whatever room he'd taken my call, his mind racing to calculate the implications of having systematically ignored a mother who apparently possessed resources and capabilities he'd never suspected. "The legal documents Margaret is preparing will ensure that my financial independence is properly protected," I continued, my voice maintaining the steady calm of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. "They'll also ensure that certain people learn the cost of taking love for granted, of treating family members like problems to be managed rather than people to be valued." "What does that mean?" Diego asked, though I suspected he was beginning to understand exactly what it meant. Beginning to grasp that his months of comfortable distance might have consequences he'd never considered possible. It means, my dear son, that abandoning people who love you is a choice that carries a price. And some bills come due when you least expect them. They came the next day. All of them. Diego arrived first, his usual composed professional demeanor replaced by the frantic energy of someone trying to prevent a disaster he was only beginning to understand. Sandra followed 20 minutes later, her designer purse clutched against her chest like armor that might protect her from conversations she'd never expected to have. Sophia came last, dragged from school with the sullen reluctance of a teenager forced to participate in adult problems she'd assumed would never affect her directly. I watched them gather in the nursing home's parking lot through my window, observing their hurried conference with the detached interest of someone studying specimens in a laboratory. Diego gestured emphatically while Sandra checked her phone, and Sophia leaned against their car with the practiced indifference of youth that hadn't yet learned that consequences sometimes reach across generations to collect debts accumulated through years of casual cruelty. Elena sat beside me at the window, her weathered hands folded in her lap, watching the family drama unfold with the satisfaction of someone witnessing long-delayed justice finally arriving at its destination. "They look worried," she observed with understated pleasure. "They should be," I replied, feeling remarkably calm for someone about to fundamentally alter the trajectory of multiple lives. Fear is an appropriate response when you realize you've been making decisions based on information you never bothered to verify. Margaret Chen had arrived an hour earlier, her briefcase filled with documents that would transform assumptions into expensive mistakes, comfort into consequences, and neglect into lessons that might prove educational for people who'd apparently forgotten the cost of taking love for granted. The conference room felt smaller with 5 people crowded around its modest table, but I'd specifically requested this setting because it was the same room where Diego had signed my admission papers 11 months earlier, where he'd spoken about temporary arrangements while his eyes avoided mine, where he'd demonstrated his relief at solving the problem of my existence through professional delegation. "Mrs. Santos," Margaret began, arranging her papers with the methodical precision of someone who'd orchestrated similar revelations before. "Shall we begin with your financial disclosure, or would you prefer to address the estate modifications first?" Diego's face went pale at the phrase, financial disclosure, while Sandra's attention snapped away from her phone with the sudden focus of someone who'd realized that whatever was happening might directly affect her comfortable lifestyle. Sophia looked confused, her adolescent brain still processing the possibility that her grandmother might be something other than the helpless burden she'd been trained to see. "Let's start with the financial disclosure," I said, settling back in my chair with the confidence of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. "I think it's important for my family to understand exactly who they've been ignoring." Margaret opened the first folder, revealing bank statements and investment summaries that painted a picture of financial security Diego had never suspected. The life insurance money from my husband's death, carefully invested over 3 years. The property I'd purchased in the expanding suburb where young families were driving up real estate values. The stock portfolio I'd built through decades of small but consistent purchases in companies I'd researched during quiet Sunday afternoons. The total liquid assets currently amount to just over $800,000, Margaret announced with professional neutrality, with additional property holdings valued at approximately $450,000, bringing Mrs. Santos's net worth to roughly $1.3 million. The silence that followed was profound enough to hear the building's ventilation system cycling on, the distant sound of wheelchairs in the hallway, the small electronic beeps that provided constant background music to institutional life. Diego's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, while Sandra's face went through a series of expressions that suggested rapid mental calculations about lifestyle implications and missed opportunities. "You're telling me," Diego finally managed, his voice carrying the strangled quality of someone trying to speak while drowning, "that you've been sitting in this nursing home for almost a year with over $1 million in assets?" "I've been residing in this nursing home," I corrected gently, making careful decisions about my future while learning exactly how much my family values my presence in their lives. The financial resources have always been available. I simply chose not to burden you with information you never asked for. Sophia looked from her father to her mother to me with the dawning comprehension of someone realizing that adults she'd trusted to understand the world had been operating with fundamentally flawed information. "Wait," she said, her teenage directness cutting through the polite confusion that had paralyzed her parents. "Abuela? You could have lived anywhere? You could have stayed in your house or moved to one of those fancy retirement communities? And you chose to stay here?" "I chose to stay here," I confirmed, "because this is where I learned to distinguish between people who care about me and people who care about what I might eventually leave them. This is where I discovered that being ignored can actually be a gift, because it provides clarity about relationships that might otherwise remain clouded by obligation and false sentiment." Margaret opened the second folder, revealing the estate planning documents that had prompted Diego's panicked phone call. "Mrs. Santos has revised her will to reflect her current understanding of family relationships and priorities," she announced. "The previous version, which left everything to her son, has been modified to better align with her values and experiences." Diego leaned forward with the desperate attention of someone trying to prevent financial catastrophe. "Modified how?" "The bulk of Mrs. Santos's estate will now be donated to organizations that provide services to elderly people who've been abandoned by their families," Margaret explained with the gentle ruthlessness of someone delivering justice disguised as legal procedure. "Additionally, a substantial trust has been established to fund programs that help nursing home residents maintain dignity and independence despite family neglect." The color drained from Sandra's face as she calculated the implications of watching over $1 million disappear into charitable causes rather than augmenting her family's lifestyle in the ways she'd apparently been anticipating. "But surely," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "surely there's still something for Diego, for Sophia. Family should take care of family." The irony of Sandra invoking family loyalty was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Here was a woman who'd systematically excluded me from family celebrations, who'd sent her love through her husband rather than picking up the phone herself, who'd treated me with the polite indifference she might show a neighbor whose name she couldn't remember. Now she was discovering that family loyalty was a two-way street, and she'd been traveling in the wrong direction for almost a year. "There is a provision for family," I said, my voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd learned to wield power without raising her voice. "Sophia will receive funds for her college education, because I believe in investing in young people's futures, even when they haven't yet learned to value the people who love them. It's possible that wisdom comes with age and experience." Sophia's relief was visible, but Diego and Sandra continued to look stricken as they processed the magnitude of what they'd lost through their assumption that I could be safely ignored indefinitely. "As for Diego," I continued, watching my son's face carefully for his reaction to what would come next, "he'll receive exactly what he's demonstrated my love is worth to him over the past 8 months. Nothing." The word hung in the air like a judgment that had been months in the making, like the culmination of every unreturned phone call, every missed holiday, every casual dismissal of the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise him. Diego's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally something that might have been recognition of consequences he'd never considered possible. "Mom, you can't be serious," he said, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who'd realized that comfortable assumptions could transform into expensive mistakes. "This is because I haven't called enough? Because I've been busy with work and family responsibilities? You're going to disinherit me over phone calls?" But he was still missing the point. Still reducing months of systematic abandonment to simple communication failures rather than fundamental choices about what kind of son he wanted to be, what kind of relationship he valued, what kind of love he was willing to offer the woman who'd given him everything. "I'm not disinheriting you because of phone calls, Diego," I said, my voice steady with the certainty of someone who'd spent months thinking through every aspect of this decision. "I'm disinheriting you because you've spent the past year demonstrating that you don't consider me family. You can't claim inheritance rights from someone you've systematically excluded from your life." Margaret closed her folders with the satisfied efficiency of someone who'd successfully delivered justice disguised as legal process. The documents are legally binding and have been properly witnessed and notarized. Mrs. Santos's cognitive competence has been thoroughly evaluated and documented. These decisions reflect her clear wishes about how her legacy should be distributed. Diego made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his assumptions. What would it take to change your mind? What do you want from us? But I was beyond wanting anything from them. The months of silence had taught me that genuine affection couldn't be negotiated or purchased, that love offered under threat of disinheritance wasn't love at all, but simply another form of manipulation. "I don't want anything from you, Diego," I said, surprised by how peaceful I felt, how complete this resolution seemed after months of pain and planning. "I wanted something with you, relationship, connection, the acknowledgement that I still mattered even after I was no longer useful. But you chose differently, and now I'm choosing differently too." They left quietly, without dramatic protests or tearful reconciliation attempts. Perhaps they understood, finally, that some consequences are permanent, that some choices can't be undone through apologies or promises of future attention. Perhaps they recognized that the woman they'd abandoned had learned to value herself in ways that made their approval irrelevant. Elena found me later that evening, sitting by our window watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me of new beginnings rather than endings. "How do you feel?" she asked, settling into her chair with the comfortable intimacy of someone who'd witnessed my transformation from victim to victor. "Free," I said, and it was the absolute truth. For the first time in years, completely free. I'd learned something valuable through my experience of abandonment and recovery. That dignity doesn't require an audience, that self-worth doesn't depend on other people's recognition, and that sometimes the greatest gift neglectful families can give you is the clarity that comes from understanding exactly who they are beneath the obligations and expectations that usually cloud such relationships. Diego had taught me that love without respect is worthless, that proximity without affection is merely geography, and that being discarded can actually be liberation if you're strong enough to see it clearly. I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, wiser than I'd been given credit for, and finally free to live according to my own values rather than other people's convenience. The nursing home had become my home by choice rather than circumstance, surrounded by people who'd earned my affection through genuine care rather than genetic connection, and my resources would serve causes that honored dignity rather than enabling ingratitude. It was, I realized, exactly the ending I'd earned through 55 years of learning that sometimes justice comes not through revenge, but through the simple act of refusing to let other people determine your worth. Some stories end with reconciliation, but the best ones end with self-respect.